All right, welcome everybody watching on YouTube to another speedrun episode. We are rapidly rising through the ranks and hitting intermediate level. Hopefully we get more mainstream openings as we slowly but surely approach the advanced level as we approach 2000. So without further ado, this might be a shorter episode. We'll see how the 10-minute games go. Let's jump right into the pool. We are at 1601, and we're playing Mindar Tehran. Rolls right off the tongue, and finally we get 1d4. Feels like it's been ages, and of course, this is spread like the plague. The London system, my favorite opening. Okay, so we faced the London, I think, in the last time we faced 1d4, and I don't remember how deeply I kind of delved into Black's options here. But essentially, my long-time recommendation against the London is the move c5. This is also what I played last time, and this is what we're going to play this time. It is a very combative line. It forces White to demonstrate a lot of theoretical knowledge right off the bat, and if White responds with a couple of lazy moves, White can end up being much worse right out of the opening, and indeed, after the move c3, White is already worse, which sounds crazy, but the diligent viewer will remember that this is in fact what we faced last time as well. A lot of London system players, they play the move c3 because it seems like the most natural way to guard the d4 pawn, and yet, after this move, White is already seriously struggling to equalize. So our response is c takes d4. Now, who can tell me, assuming that White recaptures with a pawn, I mean, recapturing the queen would be kind of crazy, what is the kind of main purpose of the move c5? What move are we preparing by pushing the pawn up to c5? Like, why does this exchange favor Black? And one way to think about it is we're essentially exploiting the main tactical drawback of the early bishop development to f4, which is that the b2 pawn is left completely exposed. Now, when I frame it like that, the move should be very obvious. Maybe some of you remember that this is the move, and it's queen b6. And amazingly, despite the apparent abundance of different ways in which White can defend the b2 pawn, all of them contain serious drawbacks, either tactical or positional. Now, White's options are restricted by the fact that we're also aiming at the d4 pawn. So queen b3 is therefore out of the question because that just hangs the d pawn. White could play queen c2, and this is, I think, what we faced last time. But after queen c2, knight c6, White falls behind in development. And in the previous London game, I showed a couple of ways that White's position can deteriorate really, really quickly. The move b3 is quite obvious. It's a natural move. But what you should notice is that White has now created a serious complex of dark square weaknesses on the queen side. In particular, if we are now to deliver a check on b4, White will no longer be able to meet the move bishop b4 check with knight c3. So maybe some of you are already pining for e5. e5 is actually a legitimate option, but that move can be prepared by first bringing the knight out to c6. This move has no downside because we're hitting the d4 pawn, and in many cases, we're essentially already ready to play e5. I actually have a feeling that this might have already happened in one of our games. And after e3, it should be very natural to you that e5 is pretty devastating. White is already almost lost. Yeah, now I'm starting to remember that I actually showed this line in the previous speedrun game. Bishop b4 check, and now you can see clearly the main drawback of putting the pawn on b3. What White wouldn't give just to retract that move and then to be able to play knight c3. That would solve all of White's problems. Of course, knight to d2 does not come even close to solving White's problems. We're following the main line of my analysis. Now, the next move is really obvious, right? Your hand should essentially be executing the next move, which is knight e4. But after White plays knight f3, this is the moment where essentially you either know the correct continuation or it's really, really easy to go wrong. Does anybody remember what Black's best move is in this position? There's a very kind of unorthodox idea that seemingly comes out of nowhere. Because I think a lot of you might be paying attention to the knight on d2, and you might be asking yourself, well, how can I increase the pressure on the knight? Maybe queen a5, maybe knight to c3 comes to mind. But a lot of you are actually remembering the move, which is to strike at the other side of the board with g5. And the way to think about this is when you're trying to emphasize or increase the pressure on a particular piece, there's two fundamental ways of doing that. You can either add attackers or you can remove defenders. And usually the options that jump out at you are the options that add attackers. It can be very easy to forget that removing a defender can be just as, if not more effective of a method. And in this case, the point of g5 is very clear. We're trying to deflect this knight from f3. So knight takes g5 is not an option. And if white plays bishop takes g5, we actually have a couple of options in response. Now, some of you might notice that black can win a piece with bishop takes d2 check, and the knight on f3 is overloaded. But believe it or not, that is not the best continuation, because remember that we've sacrificed 2 pawns. So after bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, knight takes g5, yeah, we've got an extra piece for 2 pawns. Black is better. But from d2, the knight can jump to c4 and potentially access this nasty little outpost on d6. So this is not the best that black can do. We actually have a brilliant tactical move that essentially decides the game immediately. And that move is knight takes e5, which essentially carries out the same theme as the previous move. So notice how our moves harmonize with each other. We played the move g5, seemingly to deflect the knight from f3, but it was actually to deflect the bishop from f4. This was the preliminary step. Once the bishop lost contact with the e5 pawn, now we deflect the knight from f3. And after knight takes e5, bishop takes d2 check, white actually loses the queen by force. And you should pause the video and figure out how that line goes. White loses the queen, and that is the least of white's problems because white will lose stuff after he loses the queen as well. I will, after the game, go over the line bishop g3, which I'm pretty sure I went over last time as well. If white plays bishop g3, we actually have a choice between the move g4, and if I'm not mistaken, we can also play h5 and simply go after the bishop. But this is a complete disaster for white. And this is why I like c5 against the London. At this level, c5 works incredibly well. And even at my level, it works well. I mean, it is the line that I play against other GMs too. Someone's asking, can white get 3 pieces for the queen? So, no. No. Because first of all, bishop takes e2 actually captures a minor piece. So at most, white will be able to get 2 minor pieces for the queen. But if you calculate that line out, he won't even be able to get that. So like after knight takes e5, bishop takes d2 check. If white tries to give up the queen with queen takes d2, at the end of the line, there's going to be a fork on a5. And what's hilarious about that line is not only is there a fork on a5, but once we take on e5, that also comes with a fork. We're forking like g5 and a1. So probably white is best advised to play king e2 in response to bishop takes knight. But then we have another fork with knight c3. And then we take the queen, and something similar happens after that. That's a really, really funny line. Yeah, so white is just like, how the heck did he know this line? Okay, bishop e2. So white tries to find the lesser evil, and potentially this is the lesser evil. I mean, white is completely lost either way. So now it's really important not to kind of rush into the first option that you see, because very often what I observe at especially the lower level is sometimes you demonstrate really good opening knowledge, but then you want to extract the most out of the position. You don't just want to grab the first piece that you see. You actually want to find the way to maximize the advantage so as not to, let your opponent stay in the game. So the first move here is really obvious. The first move is knight takes f3. We need to eliminate the defender. But then the big question is, how do we take on d2? Or do we take on d2? Do we maybe take on g5? And you should pause the video. I'm assuming our opponent will take with a bishop, and try to figure out how to maximize our advantage. How do we win this game quickly and efficiently rather than letting white stay in the game? So you'll have to do some calculation here. And you have to remember that all of the options are winning, right? Black is winning after all 3 viable options, knight takes g5, bishop takes d2 check, and knight takes d2. But if I'm calculating this correctly, only one option essentially wins the game on the spot. So the move that I'm inclined to play is actually knight takes d2, because bishop takes d2 may seem a little bit more tempting. But after white slides the king off over to f1, It is true that after bishop takes e2, king e2, queen b5 is a really pretty checkmate. But after bishop takes e2, king f1, the problem is that anytime we try to take on g5, white is then going to take on d2. Although, yeah, and I don't see a way around that. Actually, wait a second. I do sort of see a way around that, but it gets a little bit messy. And I'll show you a couple of lines after the game. I think knight takes d2 just eliminates any of the complications because it keeps the king in a box. So the king cannot castle because the f1 square is controlled. If the king slides up to e2, again, we have this check on b5, and that's actually mate in 2. And if white makes any other move, then we can essentially pre-move knight f3 check. Either that's going to win 2 pieces, or at the absolute worst case, it's going to win the bishop on g5, and we will be 2 whole minor pieces up. So with the move knight takes e2, we're guaranteeing that we win at least one other minor piece without the need for annoying calculation. Nor should we rush the move knight f3. We should wait to see what white does. Probably white's best move is bishop e2, but that's a pretty depressing move to play. We, of course, can also play knight takes b3 and knight takes a1 going for the extra rook. Okay, so white gives up the queen. And again, at the end of these lines, there's often going to be a fork to pick off one more minor piece. This is actually a really important theme to be aware of in, just like with combinations in general, this often happens. And I'll show you one very famous instance of this. Let me just write this down. Okay, so we're up an entire queen. I think the rest is clear without comments. Let's go d5 and get the bishop out. And now the simplest method is just to trade pieces. Let's go bishop g4. And so that game was won entirely with opening knowledge. I didn't make a single one of my own moves up until, knight takes d2. Okay, let's be fancy. Let's castle queenside, protecting d. No need to give up unnecessary pawns. I'm anticipating rook d4. One very kind of brief comment. I see a lot of people, even at higher levels, what they will do in a position like this is they'll play queen takes d4. And there's actually no need for that. You don't need to give up material in a situation like this, which is already very simple. That actually drags the game out, and it increases the chances of some sort of accident. There's absolutely no need to give up a queen for a rook here. Keeping the extra queen will ensure that you can win without any adventures. It's not like white has any counterplay using just 2 rooks. Okay, so now let's just go rook c8, try to trade off the rooks. And if white declines, then we can infiltrate the second rank. Yeah, one of those cases where it would be nice if our opponent resigned. Yeah, let's go rook c2. Obviously here I'm giving up the d5 pawn, but I'm doing that because we have bigger fish to fry. Okay, so what's the fastest way to win? Let's go queen h5. Fancy little move, immobilizing the rook. Always stay accurate until the very end. So once this rook moves, we have the move f5, and the game is over. Yeah, somebody says, I haven't brushed up on Dvoretsky's chapter, converting a full extra queen for nothing. And that would be page 536. Okay. Now I think I'm comfortable. Haven't brushed up on the proper technique. I think this might be a theoretical draw, actually. There's been a long-standing debate about the evaluation of this position, but I think most recently, the top computers did manage to find a win here, but it's really close. Yeah, probably drawn with best play, yeah. White is able to build a fortress. Boom. Look at the tactics on Naroditsky. Queen a1 mate. Another deflection. Getting the pawn into the way so that queen a1 is mate. Oh man, I hung a rook. Yeah, the quality of the speedrun is just deteriorating day by day. Boom. All right, so first of all, let me very quickly check my previous games. Okay, now you should hear me. I'm just trying to check if I have played this line before. So we want to go to Opening Tree, which is a great website, by the way, for checking. Exploring openings on chess.com and Lead Chess. Hopefully most of you are familiar with it. Playing as black, analyze games. And essentially, once you input the user, 69 games, you click View Moves, and it basically shows you everything that's been played against. You can do this in ChessBase, but Opening Tree is also a great site. So we faced the London 7 times. Twice I played g6 and 5 times c5. Now notice that we faced c3 twice, and d takes c5 twice, and c4 once, which is a bad move, obviously. And both games continued queen b6. Yeah, so the game that I was looking for is actually queen d2. This is the previous time that we faced this line, e3. And again, I played the c5 idea. So very, very similar. g5. And actually, if I remember correctly, this got really complicated, and I made an early mistake. So we'll double check queen d2 after the game. Let's go back to chess.com. Okay, so the first time we faced queen d2, this time we faced the move b3. And the first time we faced this, I did give you kind of a general overview of White's available options in this position. And I won't rehash everything because I do want to get a couple more games in. But just to hit on the important points, White's best moves in this position are either d5, d takes c5, or e3. But online, c3 is an extremely popular move. If White plays the move e3, then my recommendation is to play c takes d4, e takes d4, and still to play queen b6. So if White is not like super booked up in this position, you can kind of tell how unpleasant this type of position can be. Because most people who are unfamiliar with White's best move, they'll end up going b3. And after d5, Black already has a great position. Like White is struggling to equalize here as well. The point is that knight f3 is always met with the move bishop g4, preventing the knight from accessing the e5 square. White is forced to play c3, and you can tell how awkward this pawn structure is. White never wants to go b3 and combine it with c3 in the London. White's best move in this position is actually knight to c3, which is a very hard move to play unless you're extremely well prepared. The point is queen takes b2 essentially loses the game to knight b5. And this is a line that has been known for many, many years. The point is that after knight a6, which is forced to protect the c7 square, White plays the move a3, and suddenly the black queen is boxed in. Suddenly the queen is boxed in, and, well, and White can take his time winning the queen. This gets very computerish, but trust me, queen takes b2 is a bad move. So here my recommendation is actually to play the move a6. a6 is a very important move. Let me just pull up the chat on my phone. Just a moment, folks. Why is a6 so important? Who can tell me? Like, why not d5 instead, or knight c6, or some other move? Why not d5? Because this is a very easy move to play if you're not familiar with the subtleties of this line. Yeah, because of knight b5. But why is knight b5 something that we need to prevent? Can't we just play knight a6? Like, who can explain to me positionally, why does this type of situation favor White so strongly? So it's not so much that it's an awkward knight. The problem is that we can never really chase the knight out of b5. This is the problem. So for instance, let's say White plays a4 to solidify the knight on b5. We can play bishop d7, but taking on b5 is going to be associated with its own problems. Like, as you can tell, I mean, taking on b5 is just not an option here because White can recapture with the bishop, and White is just winning by slamming down the knight on e5. Alternatively, White can always play a takes b5 and open up the a file. So you want to avoid this type of situation. This happens in the Jabava London because the knight on b5 is essentially an eternal knight. It's like a bone in our throat. And that is why, instead of d5, you want to play this awkward-looking move a6, but it's a really important move to play. And after White plays knight f3, now already you can play queen takes b2. So this suddenly becomes a threat because knight b5 is no longer an option. Now, White often goes knight a4 in these types of situations, but here the queen can evacuate by giving a check. c3 is forced, and the queen steps back to a5. If White tries to get the knight to b6, then we beat White to the punch by playing the move b5. Here we reap the benefits of this move a6 once again. So a6 comes with kind of hidden venom in that it reinforces the threat of queen takes b2. And so White's best move is to play a3. Now again, queen takes b2, knight a4 traps the queen. And now we transition to the main idea of pushing d5. White can play knight f3, and here there are multiple ways for Black to equalize. I really like the move bishop to d7, again reinforcing the threat of queen takes b2. And if White has to waste a tempo on rook b1, we can actually reposition the bishop to g4. This is a bit computerish. We can also immediately play bishop g4, but there are some lines where the rook on b1 is actually a liability. There actually are some lines where the rook is a liability. The actual point of inducing rook b1 is in this line, after h3, bishop f3, queen f3, e6, white has the move long castle. So the point of playing bishop d7 first is that after bishop g4, h3 takes e6, white is unable to castle. You're removing castling rights, and that makes all the difference because long castles would be a really, really nasty move here. It's a really nice idea, and a pretty important kind of theme. So anyways, I don't want to get too deep into this line. This is just one of several options that white has. Against d5, my recommendation is to play d6. And against d takes e5, I like the move knight to a6, but I'm sure we'll face these moves in the future. So for now, we're going to focus on this line, queen b6. And here we face the move b3. Previously, we faced the move queen to d2, and I responded knight c6. Our opponent played e3. And here I played the move e5, which is actually not the best. The best line here is to play knight e4. And in response to queen c2, there is an incredible idea to play knight to b4. Absolutely insane. And queen takes e4, walks into d5. The queen is unable to keep contact with the c2 square. This is why I like this line. And at the end of the line, the b2 pawn is hanging. And the reason that's important is white is unable to trap the knight on a1. White is just collapsing here. If white plays the move b3, then we can play knight takes b3. A takes b3, queen takes b3, king c1. And who can tell me the final move of the sequence? Who can tell me the final move of the sequence? Yeah, bishop f5. It's a simple move, creating a gazillion threats against white's king, and white loses the game. So you can do a little bit of digging on your own. Just because there's so much theory, I don't want to spend 3 hours giving you the rundown. Let's focus on the move b3. So knight to c6, and already white is in huge trouble. Just so you know, after e3, it's already like +2. White's last chance to maintain a semi-feasible position was knight f3. And here, e5 is no longer as effective because the d2 square is under white's control. Here, the best move, according to the computer, is actually just to go knight e4 anyway. This prevents d5. And if white goes e3, then yet again, we have this idea to play g5. This time, knight takes g5 fails to another fork. Actually, we had this exact fork during the game. So if white drops the bishop back to g3, the crux of black's idea is to play h5. And I've explained this before. This also exists in the Jabava London. The point is we're threatening to trap the bishop with h4. If white tries to chase the knight out of e4, we have the move d5, reinforcing the threat of h4. And of course, the main point is that if white pushes his own h-pawn, then and only then are we able to take on g3, completely ruining white's pawn structure. The computer actually suggests to first give a check, then to take on g3, and then to push g4, when this knight has no good square to escape to. And white's position is in complete shambles. Knight g5, we can just play f6, and the knight keeps getting tossed around. Knight g to e4, d5. This is complete disaster. Knight f2, bishop h6, another tempo move. I mean, just look at this. Queen e2, queen c3, white can resign. Everything collapses. A lot of energy in this line for black. So white's last chance here would have been to go bishop to e5, which is absolutely not an easy move to play. And the point is that after f6, bishop g3, h5, apparently white can play d5 and maintain some chances, even though black can go h4 here. And after bishop takes h4, we just drop the knight away to d8. Look at this line. The bishop has to move back to g3, and white cannot recapture with the h-pawn because the h-file is now open. And this is minus over plus. So there's just like endless lines like this in this line. But once our opponent goes e3, e5 should be completely logical too. D takes e5, bishop e4, knight d2, knight e4. If white goes king to e2 here, we have another tactic and another fork-based tactic with knight takes e5. And then queen b5 check picks up the bishop, which traps the rook. Just unbelievable. Just unbelievable amounts of tactics. So, okay, knight d2 is essentially forced, knight to e4, knight gf3, and now the main idea, which is, of course, g5. Who can tell me, once again, if the bishop drops back to g3? This is a trick question. What is black's best move? This is a trick question. So there's two moves that essentially win the game, but one is much, much more convincing than the other. So it's actually not g4. It's actually not g4, because after g4, white can play a3. And suddenly the situation becomes very, very complicated. And the reason why is if you play bishop a5, the bishop gets trapped. But it seems like black has the move bishop c3, right? You also can't play bishop takes d2 because then the knight moves away from the attacking square and simply recaptures. But after bishop c3, rook c1, you take on f3, white takes on c3, sacking another exchange. And suddenly at the end of the line, things are a lot more complicated than they appear because of this idea to play knight c4 and then knight d6. This pawn on e5 is extremely unpleasant. White has a pretty big initiative and a lot of compensation for the rook. For this reason, you actually want to go h5, exploiting the fact that, again, white cannot play h4 because of knight takes g3 and queen takes e3. And if white plays a3, you can simply liquidate everything on d2, eliminating any possible shenanigans with the knight, and then you play h4, trapping the bishop. So I know this is a lot of theory, but good for people to know this. Our opponent just succumbed immediately with bishop takes g5, and now a second deflection with knight takes e5. And now the game is just completely over. Obviously, knight takes e5, bishop takes d2 check. And as I indicated, white has to play king e2. And yeah, knight c3 check here is possible. The computer move here is actually d5. This is the top engine move, which is pretty crazy. It's not to deliver the fork immediately because white's position is just like so bad that the fork isn't even going anywhere. The point is that if white plays f3, now you deliver the fork. King takes d2, knight takes d1. And the whole point of playing d5 is that you're able to fork these two minor pieces with f6. Whereas immediately forking on c3 and then taking the queen, if you play f6, white can drop the knight back with tempo. So if d5 is played against you, you can stop the clock and call the arbiter, or you can write Danny Wrench a personal email. Knight c3 check also, of course, is completely winning. And after bishop e2, we play knight takes c2. Our opponent gave up the queen, but there was absolutely nothing that white could do. Any questions? Always look for forks at the end of these lines. I know that was pretty theory heavy, but I'm pretty passionate about teaching people how to beat the London. So good game for people to analyze on their own. If there are any lines that I didn't go over, you can definitely pull this game up and dig around on your own. Let's play one more. We have the white pieces this time, and we're facing a Scandi. Let's see which line we end up facing. Knight f6. Okay, so this is, I think, the Portuguese variation. We have faced it before in previous speedruns, and as some of you might remember, I recommend the move bishop b5 check. And here I recommend like an old Russian line, which is certainly not the best line. If you check the recent chessable courses, I'm pretty sure bishop c4 is often recommended. But my coach taught me the move bishop e2, which avoids theory. It gives a nice stable advantage, and it's not the move that people who play this line with black like to face. Okay, c6 is a ridiculous move. This just gives away a pawn for no reason. Black is trying to go for some semblance of compensation, but provided that we protect the g2 pawn, our position is excellent. So now we just go knight f3, developing and defending. And I think some people would get a little bit scared, especially black is playing very quickly, but there is no magic in chess, right? Development is equal. Both of us have developed two pieces. Black has given up a center pawn. There's absolutely no reason that this should be dangerous. Now, I think a lot of you who are looking at this position, your instinct might be to go d3. But I think d3 is not the way to maximize our advantage. The question you should ask yourself is, first of all, should we take on e5? And I think knight e5 is fine, but bishop takes g2 looks a little bit messy. We'd have to move the rook. Then we wouldn't be able to castle. That to me seems unnecessarily messy. But e4 is actually not a threat. Like, let's imagine that black plays e4 in this position. We can just jump our knight into e5. And the knight on e5 is under zero danger because it can always be supported with a move d4. So I actually think we need to simply keep developing and invite the move e4. Now we're threatening to grab the bishop pair. Black continues to play instantly. And actually here, if we want to be super accurate, we don't even need to rush the move knight takes c6. We can start by playing d4, solidifying the knight. And if black takes en passant, which of course is forced, well, I guess it's not. If black would have taken en passant, we actually can still take the bishop first and then recapture on d3 using some nice tactics. All right, so black castles, which means our knight can remain safely entrenched on e5. We can also take on c6, largely a matter of taste. But I think the best way to punish black for his shenanigans is to develop the bishop to g5, creating this really, really nasty pin. Okay, h6, bishop h4, no problem. Obviously, we're not worried about bishop takes e5. Okay, so what should we do now? Well, we have an extra pawn. So we have essentially the 4-on-2 on the queen side. How do we exploit it? I think the most straightforward way is to play c4. And then to develop the knight to c3 and eventually to prepare the move d5. Notice that this knight on e5 is actually it's a great asset rather than a weakness. We don't need to exchange this knight at the first available opportunity. In fact, I would much rather keep this knight because the bishop on c6 is a totally useless piece. Let's keep developing. Let's keep developing. Thank you very much. And the game is over. Whoopsie daisy. I think black forgot to play bishop b7. He did all of that to fianchetto the bishop and then ended up blundering it. Yeah. Not black's finest day in the office. Yeah, move order is important, folks. Always get the move order right. Okay, to be fair, the position was already a disaster. But I think the instructive moment, well, there's two instructive moments when it comes to the opening play. The first was not to rush with a move like d3, which was a lot more passive. So we invited the move e4. And then the second was not just to exchange on c6 at the first available opportunity, to realize that when the knight on e5 is protected like this, it's actually a very, very safe piece. The worst, absolute worst that can happen is black piles up on the knight and wins a pawn back. But that's the absolute worst that can happen because the d4 pawn is such a well-protected pawn. Yeah. Okay, is our opponent just going to stall out the clock here? That would not be good. And I think we're about 1600. We're entering a level where these relatively small technical things start becoming really important. Like, I wasn't drawing as much emphasis on this when we were 1300. At that point, we're just focused on the big things. When you enter intermediate level, of course, a lot of games are still going to be decided by one-move blunders, as it was here. A lot of games are going to be decided by superior opening knowledge, like the previous game. But these positional subtleties, when you stack them together, that's what creates a lot of the power in your play. The things that are really easy to skip over if you're just looking at a game superficially, and short castles is exactly that kind of move that you really want to understand. Why did I play that? Thank you for resigning. So just really quickly, obviously, black should play knight takes d5. And here the point is simply to go d4 and quickly to push c4. In fact, black's only move here to avoid being much worse is bishop f5. If black plays a move like e6, and after c4, white is a clear advantage. Bishop f5 is a really nice move because it prepares to meet c4 with knight b4, which is why we should delay the move c4, and which is why we should start by playing a3 and only then play c4. So for instance, if bishop e7, we can start by playing a3, and after c4, white has a very pleasant position. One thing to remember is that knight to b4 is not dangerous, provided that our pawn is on c2. Because after knight a3, we can just chase the knight away with c3. But a serious positional error would be to play c4, because now if we play knight a3, much like in the previous game, this knight is a very, very nasty piece. We had exactly the same idea in the previous game. So just a good rule of thumb. In the Jabava London, this is a very, very common theme as well, where a lot of players who are less experience of the black pieces, they will play a move like c5, allowing us to entrench a knight on b5. And it's exactly the same concept. Black is struggling here because this knight is just like a bone in black's throat. Okay, so obviously our opponent played a really bad line. After knight e5, yeah, we played d4. And really the only thing we had to calculate was e takes c3, we have knight takes c6. And if d takes e2, we take on e2 with check, winning black's queen. And otherwise, we just get the bishop pair. We have an extra pawn for no compensation and a great position. I think once black failed to take on passant, black's position becomes even worse. Obviously, black should have played bishop b7, but now we can even push d5. Or alternatively, we can play a move like f3, just eliminating arguably black's only asset in this position, eliminating the e-pawn and getting just an overwhelming position. So, all right, guys, I'm feeling pretty tired. So that's where we'll end for tonight. 2 10-minute games. And the next speedrun episode will be longer, I promise you that. But I hope you enjoyed. Maybe I'll try to make 3,200 off stream. And I will try to get a stream in tomorrow. Probably will be a bit shorter, but I'll try to stream toward the evening. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night and have a great Sunday.